Thank you, and it's my task to just give a few brief words describing, or rather summarising, the key conclusions of the day. I feel a little bit like Dahi O'Shea on the Rose of Tralee going around describing all of the roses, for those of you who watch it, and their key features or special turns. But in fact, I'm not going to do that at all. I think the day has been an absolutely amazing mixture for everyone of a whole variety. Someone described it as the most eclectic mix of discussions and presentations. But for me particularly, the great benefit was that, unlike most sort of science type conferences, this was actually very much about making things happen and about making something meaningful. And I think that that has distinguished it for me from many of the other conferences that we go to, because it really is, because it's focused upon citizen engagement. And I wondered to myself, why is this has it come to prominence? And obviously this was described very, very well by some of the speakers in the morning, who described, the reference things like the Sustainable Development Goals and the Aarhus agreement, which all require very much that information is made available to the public and that the citizens are engaged. But even more so, the references to the fact that there are more of us on the planet, and we're living closer together in urban communities. I think we said 70% of Europeans are living in urban and city communities, which overall requires a new approach to living. And that's really why we've got to have citizen engagement involved in all of our deliberations and discussions, rather than the traditional type of planning approach, which was very, very meaningful, as I think described by John in the morning. The European approach is based on treaties, which is at the highest level possible. But actually making it all happen at a local level is what means the difference to you and to me and to all of our families. So we also know more than ever before about what our fellow citizens are doing, and that was described very well by many of the speakers through the traditional and social media, the laws which require transparency about planning, licensing, environmental regulation, through apps, through the websites that we're all involved in. But yet, this information is not equally available to everybody. And I think those points were made very clearly by many of the people, in fact, who asked questions, as well as the speakers, that inequality in access to this information is clearly an issue also. So the other thing that came across to me very much was the contrast between some of the things described. If 70% of people are living in urban areas, yet Iski's description of the research that's being done on the value of blue-green spaces, that is an enormous inherent challenge in everything that we do going forward, because there's no plan, except in Cloughjordan, to reverse the urbanisation. And the movement seems to be in an almost inexorable urbanisation direction. And we see that with plans to divert water from the Shannon to feed the east of the country, which must happen unless other things are there to prevent it. So for me, I think trying to make sense of the set of discussions today, I'm not going to touch on every individual presentation, but there were 3 words to me that seemed to link everything that was discussed. The first one was connection, the second was design, and the third was resilience. The connection of health to well-being and well-being and the environment seems to be absolutely agreed. There's no doubt about that. But yet, the very, I think as Simon described, the great diversity of agencies that are involved in the environment and in the whole health and well-being area and in our local communities provides a huge challenge in itself, because there won't be the same answer for every local community or every area, or indeed the same level of agreement. Deirdre, I think, also made that point when she was describing the citizens, the rising, and the work that was done around that. And she definitely said, you know, it's going to be messy, because if the citizen engagement is really, really working, then you have to take on board what people say. And I think all of those things, the connectedness, and yet the challenge of actually using those connections to the best advantage were very much brought out by many of the speakers. Then the second word was design, because I think that in so many of the descriptions of the case studies and of the work that's being done in Dublin, the smart cities, the work that the EPA are doing with National College of Art and Design, Simon's presentation about how design can actually shape what's happening to make it worthwhile. That in itself is a hugely innovating area, and I think it's one of the things that for me has been drawn out of everything that people have said, that we accept the connection, but and that the connectedness is so important in linking health to well-being and to making improvements. But how do we design these areas to get the best bang for our buck? And there were so many different approaches described that I think there's a huge sense of energy in going forward. And the third area was resilience, because the thing that also kept being mentioned was the pace of change. And I think what Jamie described about the Dublin being the smart city, the city that, you know, perhaps has got more brain power in terms of development and more potential for developing smart solutions. It is obviously true, and you know, Ireland has really invested in all of that. But how does that work? And there were so many good examples there of how resilience at a technological level could be made to work. But then they were balanced by the descriptions that Davy had of the resilience of communities, because communities and individuals are the people who put those, either to make the decisions about whether or not to use the solutions or the techniques. And I think the description of all the work that's been done in Cloughgeorgian and with Sustainable Ireland, and the efforts that are being made to use what is an innate resilience in our communities, and to harness all of those things in our individuals. That's the key to making what we talk about at the highest levels, or in our policy, or as some said, policy wonks. I like that. And to make all those things real. And it's about, everything changes. You know, 10 years ago we wouldn't have been having a conversation like this. In 10 years' time we will be having a completely different or more evolved conversation based on what's happened to us in the meantime. So resilience is how we move from one stage to the next and how we adapt. And I think there were amazing descriptions and great signs there for how we can work with that in developing the betterment of health and the environment through citizen engagement. So there are a couple of questions about it, I think. Next year was one of the things that I was asked to mention about what came out of today that could shape next year's agenda. And there were certainly some very pointed questions that were being raised about the availability of real information within some of the public sector services, particularly in health and others, about that could be linked to environmental developments, such as the enhanced air quality monitoring network that was described by Patrick. And that's going to happen in the next few years. And if we don't move towards developing the information, the readily available information within health and mortality and other services, then that won't be possible to make those links. Equally, it won't be possible to look at the inequalities that have been highlighted, and we may have a situation, unless we have that information, where the enhancements we're talking about could widen some of the disparities. So perhaps worth drawing that out as a possible theme for next year, that data to support citizen engagement, to actually deliver our obligations under the Aarhus Directive and the Sustainable Development Goals, maybe that's something that we could explore a bit further. Jonathan asked me to mention one specific thing before I finished. That was that there is a questionnaire on each of the seats, and please fill it in and just leave it on the seat, because that will be very useful to the committee who organised the group, or organised the day. And finally, I just want to thank everybody for coming along, and mention just one person who, if he had been alive today, would be 350 tomorrow. That's Jonathan Swift, who's occupied a house just around the corner. He was the Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral and the author of, obviously, Gulliver's Travels. And you know, I was thinking earlier on about him because of the whole thing we were saying about messages in the media. And I think he's one of the few people that still has a book in print after 300 years, you know? And that must mean that satire, you know, as satire works. And he described, I think in his day, there was also a population issue, you know? And we're talking about the gradual explosion of the population on our planet and how we have to work within them. He obviously had ideas, but no one was listening to them. So his answer was to write the modest proposal, which some of you, I think, may remember. And the title of that was, "For preventing the children of poor people in Ireland from being a burden to their parents or country, and for making them beneficial to the public." And of course his proposal was that after 1 year, and he gave a very, you know, astute economic analysis of the low costs of sustaining them for their first year because they were breastfed, and by then they would make a very nutritious meal. So with that, I will say goodbye then, and thank you very much indeed.